He watched me like a threat, silent, unmoving, while the rest of the board gave me a standing ovation. No questions, no smile, just eyes that said, "You won't be here long." It was my proudest moment, unveiling the leadership program I spent 19 months building. But in that exact moment, with every executive cheering, one man, the new CEO, refused to even blink. And somehow, I knew. They weren't clapping for my future. They were applauding my exit. The applause came before I even finished the last slide. I paused, not for effect, but because I wasn't used to being interrupted by standing ovations in a boardroom. Around the polished oak table, suits and silk ties leaned forward, grinning, some clapping with both hands, while others typed excited notes into their tablets. Years of research, testing, and fieldwork had finally distilled into a framework I called EQ Confront TM, an emotional intelligence training system for leaders who needed more than buzzwords. At 53, I'd outlasted 3 CEOs, watched 2 failed rebrands, and kept this company from crumbling during the remote work freefall. But this felt like my legacy. "Callie," said Douglas Hanley, our outgoing CEO and someone I quietly admired, "this isn't just a program. This is a mirror. And I think we all know how badly our leaders need one right now." More nods. More praise. Someone from compliance whispered "game changer" under their breath. I allowed myself a small smile, folding my notes with a calm precision that masked the pride humming just beneath my blazer. Still, something tugged at me. In the far corner of the room, near the tinted glass that overlooked the skyline, one man hadn't moved. No applause, no reaction, just a still figure in a gray suit, legs crossed, fingers steepled in front of his chin like he was observing a court deposition. Roland Chase, the newly appointed CEO. Fresh from some hedge fund on the East Coast, his reputation came with sharp turns, cost cuts, culture flips, and replacing legacy teams faster than HR could print exit letters. He didn't speak, didn't challenge, didn't even flinch when I introduced the section called Self-Authority and the Cost of Control. Most execs asked questions when that slide came up. He stared through it like glass. As the meeting adjourned, people buzzed around me, offering congratulations, asking for copies, inviting me to lead the first rollout in Sedona next quarter. Roland stood, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out without a word. I tucked that moment away like a thin crack behind wallpaper, easy to ignore, but impossible to forget. Something in his silence felt loaded, and though the room still echoed with praise, something in me whispered, "This isn't over, it hasn't even begun." What I didn't know was that the very system I built, the one they cheered today, would become the trap that undid him, and that I, the architect of their reflection, would be the only one who could lead him through it. 3 days after the applause, my nameplate was gone. It happened quietly. No drama, no meeting request, just a calendar alert for a brief check-in with HR and a neutral-toned email from Roland Chase's office with no subject line. The kind of message designed not to draw attention, like a whisper in the hallway before the door closes. I arrived at the 13th floor conference room at 9 a.m. sharp. 2 chairs, 1 folder. A woman from HR I didn't recognize. Young, polite. Reading from a script so rehearsed it felt like voiceover for an exit commercial. She thanked me for my tremendous contributions over nearly 2 decades and offered a severance package that sounded generous, but came with one catch: immediate termination, effective today. No cause, no complaints, just restructuring. I blinked once, didn't even ask why. The question would have insulted both of us. Behind her was a framed photo of the company's original leadership team. I was in that picture, standing off-center in a navy pantsuit, younger, sharper, still believing loyalty would outlast ambition. Is Roland behind this decision? I asked, calmly. She didn't flinch, but her silence said enough. I signed the paperwork with the same pen I'd used to outline Module 7 of the leadership program just 2 weeks earlier. By 10:15 a.m., my access badge was deactivated, my inbox redirected, my office already cleared out, a fresh name stenciled onto the frosted glass door. Rachel Duvall, VP Organizational Strategy, 28 years old, fast-tracked from a consulting firm in Chicago, smiled like she hadn't read the full history of the program she now owned. I didn't blame her, not really, not yet. What got me, what actually stung, wasn't the exit itself. I've survived bigger losses. It was the speed, the erasure. How quickly something you built with your whole spine can be rebranded with a different font and a flashier face. But I said nothing. I walked out with dignity, heels clicking on the marble like punctuation marks no one could edit. The elevator doors closed. I exhaled once, and I didn't cry. That evening, a former colleague forwarded me a screenshot. It was an internal memo sent by Roland's chief of staff to senior directors. Excited to announce that our new leadership development initiative, Project Ascend, is moving forward under the guidance of Rachel Duvall and her team. Program design credits go to the Development Strategy Unit, led by Rachel and executive sponsors from HR. Project Ascend was my program. Every module, every sequence, even the diagram at the bottom of the memo was taken directly from the visual framework I'd presented 4 days earlier. Only now. The attribution box at the bottom right had been replaced. My name, Callie Whitmore, was gone. In its place, developed by Organizational Strategy Team. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. It wasn't rage I felt. It was that cold, detached feeling you get when someone tries to steal a part of your soul, but forgets to take the part that made it work. The next morning, I went for a walk through the city, same route I used to take before board meetings. Except this time, I walked slower, observing, listening, letting the wind tug gently at the collar of my coat as if to say, "You're not done here." That night, I printed every original version of the program from my personal drive, dated, watermarked, time-stamped, not for revenge, just in case, because the difference between stealing something and understanding it is always revealed under pressure. And they were about to find out what happens when you run my system. Without me. I didn't post a farewell on LinkedIn. No announcement. No cryptic quote about doors closing or windows opening. I left as quietly as they'd hoped I would, heels tapping once across the marble lobby. Coat folded over one arm, smile intact. But silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance. Not obsessively, just enough. A bookmarked internal newsletter here. A forwarded all-hands update there. The new leadership program, rebranded as Project Ascend, was already rolling out. They moved fast. Too fast. The original design was never meant to be rushed. Each module was layered with reflection points, emotional anchoring, and incremental shifts. It wasn't corporate training. It was engineered discomfort, purposefully personal, and without the right facilitation, it would collapse under its own weight, which, as it turned out, was exactly what began happening. On the third week after my departure, I received a message from an old friend still at the company. It was just one sentence. "They're not running it the way you built it." I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need to, because I knew. They had taken my architecture, stripped its foundation, painted over the cracks, and expected it to stand tall. But I had designed it to demand truth, and truth doesn't tolerate shortcuts. Rachel, the new VP, had started leading rollout sessions herself. She meant well, I think. But her approach was clinical, safe, surface level. Leadership teams went through the motions, checked boxes, completed reflections like they were compliance forms, but no one changed, because no one was challenged. Then, Late one evening, as I was settling into bed with a cup of tea and an old journal, my phone buzzed. It was a name I hadn't seen in years, Marco Lin, one of the most promising managers I'd ever trained. Quiet thinker, big listener, the kind of person who didn't speak often, but always noticed everything. His message read, "Callie, no one understands the logic behind these modules. It's like they're trying to solve riddles without the key. Everyone's confused, even the facilitators." I stared at the screen for a moment, not in triumph, in quiet heartbreak. I'd poured nearly 2 years into that program, every exercise calibrated, every question purposeful. And now, in the hands of people who saw it as just another leadership product, it had become unintelligible, hollow, like someone trying to play a symphony without knowing what the notes meant. I typed back, "It was never meant to be read like a manual." Then I paused and deleted it. Instead, I wrote, "Hang in there, Marco, just stay curious." Because if there's one thing I'd learned over 2 decades in corporate training, it's that systems may get erased, but the people they shaped don't forget. They remember who challenged them, who respected them, who believed they could lead differently. I closed the message and looked out the window. The city was still humming. People still working late, still chasing promotions, still attending webinars on empathy and leadership, led by people who had never practiced it. And somewhere inside that skyline, a system I built was being misunderstood, maybe even misused. But I didn't feel powerless. I felt patient. Because sometimes, the most dangerous kind of silence is the one that's waiting to be asked back. And soon enough, they would. I wasn't watching everything, but the signals kept finding me. They trickled in like little betrayals wrapped in corporate language, delays in rollout, misalignment with facilitator expectations, and my personal favorite, temporary suspension of Module 5 due to delivery inconsistencies. I knew what that meant. Module 5 was always the breaking point. It forced leaders to name the emotional cost of their authority, to face who they'd hurt in their climb and why they thought it was worth it. It was the one module that even the most seasoned executives dreaded. And now, it was on pause. That week, 2 external consultants, both highly regarded, both brought in by Roland to lend legitimacy to the training, formally pulled out of the project. Their exit memo was carefully worded but clear. Due to significant conceptual drift from the original framework and inability to execute core content with clarity, we respectfully withdraw our participation from Project Ascend. That phrase, conceptual drift, nearly made me laugh. It was the diplomatic way of saying, "You broke something you didn't understand." But beneath the bitterness, I couldn't help feeling something else, a flicker of vindication. You can steal content, but you can't steal comprehension. And that program, despite how cleanly they scrubbed my name from it, still bore my fingerprints in every uncomfortable question they couldn't answer. I would have left it at that. Let them flounder. Let the program fail quietly behind closed boardroom doors. But then came the email. It arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, buried between a dental appointment confirmation and a promotional newsletter I never unsubscribed from. The subject line was blank. The sender? Kenneth Stokes, one of the 2 consultants who had just withdrawn. His message was brief, no greeting, no signature. Just this. "Callie, just between us. Who really wrote this program? Because there's no way this level of depth came from that new team. They don't even speak in full frameworks." I sat back in my chair, eyes fixed on the screen. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something better. Recognition. Someone out there, someone neutral, someone professional, had looked into the guts of the program and knew. This didn't come from someone winging it in Canva the night before a pitch. And maybe he didn't know everything, but he knew enough to realize there was a mind behind the material, a method behind the discomfort, a human being behind the mirror. I didn't reply right away. I let the message sit. In truth, I didn't know what I would say. Some part of me wanted to reply with a sharp one-liner. Tell your client to check the metadata. Another part just wanted to say thank you instead. I forwarded the email to myself, saved it in a folder labeled Reflections, and left it at that. I didn't need credit. I didn't even need a win. But knowing that the program was still making people feel something, even if it wasn't being delivered properly, was enough. For now. Later that evening, I received a second message, this time from a former mentee of mine, Ellie Vaughn, now a mid-level leader in operations. She wrote, "Hi, Callie. Weird question. Did you teach something about the cost of silence in the old modules? Because people keep asking me where that came from. I told them to look it up, but they can't find it anywhere. And honestly, it sounds like something you would have said." I smiled, because she was right. I had. It was a line buried in the notes of Module 7, never spoken aloud, but always felt. The cost of silence is usually paid by the people beneath you. Apparently, it had survived the edits. Apparently, it had survived me. And that's the thing about real systems. Even when you erase the author, the truth they built into the structure still echoes, even when it hurts. Especially then. The email came at 10:30 a.m. on a Wednesday. No subject line, no company name, just a signature block from an external leadership consulting firm I'd never worked with. Riverstone Facilitation Group. The message was short, precise, and strangely vague. Ms. Whitmore, we'd like to inquire about your availability for a confidential executive training engagement. Private setting. Customized framework. Top-tier leadership. Immediate scheduling preferred. Kindly respond if interested, and we'll forward further details. I sat back, rereading it. There was no mention of Aldridge and Vale, no reference to Project Ascend, the program they'd taken from me and butchered into chaos. But the tone, the words customized framework and top-tier leadership, it all pointed to one thing. They were in trouble, and someone had realized they couldn't fix it without going back to the source. I replied 2 hours later. Just a line. Available for further details. Please advise on scope and timeline. The response came fast. Too fast for a firm that supposedly worked with multiple clients. Attached was a non-disclosure agreement marked Level 3, tiered confidentiality, along with a preliminary scope of work. Private off-site delivery of executive behavioral leadership training. Emphasis on emotional confrontation modules and adaptive leadership response. Client requires non-disclosure of all participant identities. No recording permitted. Full materials review subject to final approval. Payment in full prior to session delivery. Rate, 5x standard facilitation fee, 5 times. And full payment upfront. No trainer in the world, no matter how seasoned, commands that kind of rate unless something has already gone off the rails. I clicked on the NDA. Scanning clauses. One line stopped me cold. Client identity. Echo Tier 1 entity. That code. I hadn't seen it in over a year. Echo was the name I'd given to a hidden feedback system in my original program. It was never made public, never written into external docs, just embedded inside the facilitator version of Module 6. Only 2 people had ever seen it, me and Roland Chase. I closed my laptop and stood, walking slowly to the kitchen for coffee I no longer wanted. My fingers were cold, but not from fear, from calculation. They weren't just inviting me back. They were trying not to admit I'd ever left. And yet, they wanted me to fix the very thing I warned them would break without me. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so insulting. I called my lawyer, a former employment counsel turned freelance contract hawk. David Shaw didn't flinch when I read the NDA aloud. "They're terrified," he said flatly. "No one pays in advance unless they've already failed. If you accept, triple confirm your authorship rights, and get in writing that you're bringing in your own version of the program. Unedited." I nodded. already opening the original folder on my private drive. I never gave them the version with Module 7 fully active, I said quietly. They wouldn't have known how to use it anyway. That night, I crafted my response. Confirming receipt. I accept under the following condition. Delivery of training will be under my exclusive structure, with no modifications to framework or sequence. My version, my terms. The reply came within 5 minutes. Terms approved. Payment processing, session location, and time forthcoming. I stared at the screen. Heart still, but thoughts racing. No names, no location yet, no attendee list. They didn't want me to know who I'd be training, but I already did. There was only one person who'd fight that hard to erase my name, and now needed me badly enough to offer 5 times the fee with zero leverage. Roland. He was the kind of man who would never ask for help. He would bury the failure, blame the structure, then hire someone to sweep the mess, quietly, discreetly. But this program, it was never designed to be quiet. I closed my laptop, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. They'd tried to erase the architect. Now they were paying for the map. And this time, I'd be holding the mirror. Sedona was quiet in a way that felt intentional, like the silence itself had been designed. I arrived just before 8 a.m., dropped off by a discreet black SUV with no company logo, no uniformed driver. The retreat center sat folded into the red cliffs like a secret. Terracotta stone, glass walls, and open-air design meant to invite clarity, or, at the very least, disarm defensiveness. I stepped out, breathing in the dry air, and rolled my suitcase slowly across the stone path. No one greeted me with a clipboard. No concierge asked for ID. That was the first sign. This was not a corporate retreat. It was a quiet correction. I'd been here once before, years ago, shadowing a C-suite immersion workshop. Back then, I was the assistant. Now, I was the authority, and I moved like it. Inside, the training room was nearly ready. A semicircle of leather chairs faced a low stage. The lighting was soft, golden. Bottled water stood precisely aligned next to personalized notepads that held no logos, just embossed initials. Clean, discreet, controlled. But the layout needed adjusting. I asked the staff to reposition the chairs slightly tighter, reducing physical distance between participants. I removed the stage altogether. No elevated platform. I wasn't here to lecture. I was here to reveal. I dimmed the lights another 5%. Not enough to make the room dark, but just enough to prevent any one person from feeling too exposed. Leaders' posture and brightness, they reflect in shadow. Next, I rewrote my opening. I'd originally planned to begin with a warm anecdote about growth mindset. That was out. Too safe. Instead, I replaced it with a short provocation. Before we begin, I'll ask each of you to write down one thing you avoid discussing at work. You won't be asked to share it, but I will know if it's not real. That usually lands, and more importantly, it disarms. By 10:45 a.m., the final setup was in place. Flip charts tucked, exercise decks sorted. I brought my own timer, my own sound cues, and most importantly, my own sequencing. I wasn't using the gutted version they'd run into the ground. No, this was the original. The one they thought they could separate from its author. A soft knock on the glass door pulled me from my notes. A retreat coordinator entered, clipboard in hand, eyes cautious. "I have your attendee list," she said quietly. "Internal use only, no copies permitted." I nodded, taking the single sheet of paper and flipping it open slowly. The names came first: Chief Strategy Officer, Global Marketing Director, 2 regional presidents, all expected. I scanned past them, not lingering, until I hit the final row. My eyes stopped. Roland Chase, Chief Executive Officer, no title, no highlight, no disclaimer, just listed, like anyone else. But Roland was not like anyone else. He was the man who had dismissed me without a sentence of thanks, the man who had gutted my work and handed it to someone else with a fake smile, the man now about to sit in my circle and look into a mirror he once tried to shatter. I folded the list calmly and handed it back. "Thank you," I said. "One adjustment. Please place an extra chair. Front row, center." The coordinator hesitated. "That seat is usually for—" "I know," I cut in gently. "That's why." She nodded and left the room. I took one last walk around the space, tapped the clicker in my palm, reviewed the first few slides. Everything was set, outside. The Sedona breeze rustled the glass walls. Inside, the reflection was waiting. They thought they'd hired a facilitator, but what they'd really summoned was a mirror. The room was nearly full, but one chair remained conspicuously empty. It was the chair I'd positioned front and center, on purpose, a deliberate choice. It faced me directly, with no table, no barrier, just space. And whatever honesty the occupant chose to bring with them, the executives had arrived quietly, their voices hushed by the open-air stillness of Sedona. Some offered polite nods. A few thanked me for the accommodations. Most simply took their seats and looked anywhere but at each other. And then we waited. He was 10 minutes late, exactly 10. Not 12, not 8. That wasn't forgetfulness. It was a message. At 9:40 a.m., the glass door opened, and Roland Chase walked in. Black suit, no tie, no greeting, no eye contact. He moved with the kind of confidence that wasn't warm, just practiced, like someone who believed presence alone should earn respect. He didn't scan the room. He didn't look for allies. He simply walked to the front, sat in the chair I'd prepared, and folded his hands in his lap. No clipboard, no pen. Noted. I didn't address his lateness. I didn't need to. The others had already noticed. Instead, I stepped forward and opened the session with the same clarity I always brought to a first hour. "This room is not about titles," I said. "It's about insight, today. You'll be invited to speak not from strategy, but from memory. Not about what you control, but about what controls you." There was a pause. Not heavy, just expectant. Then we began. The first activity was conflict mapping, a foundational exercise designed to surface unspoken power dynamics. Each participant received a worksheet with one prompt. Describe a situation where your authority caused harm, intended or not, and how you handled the aftermath. Silence at first, then rustling paper, a few deep breaths. The chief strategy officer went first, recounting a time she'd reassigned a high-performing employee without consultation. "I meant well," she said, "but I didn't realize how much trust I broke until they resigned." Others followed. One admitted to using silence to punish dissent. Another recalled forcing an underprepared colleague into a presentation, just to meet a deadline. The room began to soften, not in volume, but in tone. Then it was Roland's turn. He didn't lift his pen, didn't glance at the worksheet. He just stared forward, arms now crossed, jaw tight. I gave him space. No pressure. I moved to the next person, but his silence lingered like smoke in the air, unspoken, but heavy. When we reached the role-play module, I offered everyone a scenario and asked them to break into triads. Each would take turns playing the leader, the team member, and the observer. Roland didn't move. The VP of Ops looked at him, hesitating. "Roland, are you with us in Group 2? "No," he said flatly. "I'll just watch." It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. I walked over slowly and met his gaze, not confrontational, just steady. "In this exercise," I said calmly, "observation is a role, but withdrawal is not. If you prefer not to participate, that's your decision, but it will be noted." He looked away, said nothing. I turned back to the group. "Let's begin." And so we did, without him. The room continued, but his chair, so deliberately placed, sat still. Stiff. A few participants glanced his way during the exercise. No one said it aloud, but the shift had happened. Power, once assumed, had been visibly withheld, and the room adjusted around it. I made no comment. I offered no judgment. But in my notebook, I wrote a single line. First crack. Refusal to engage, threat to image, may signal deeper fracture beneath surface. As the session ended, I closed the exercise with a short debrief. Insight is not earned through agreement, I said. It's earned through courage. The mirror only works if you look. Roland stood and left before the others. No goodbye, no expression. I let him go. But I also knew something had begun. The first crack doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to spread. By the second morning, the stillness in the room had changed. It wasn't nervous anymore. It was dense, heavy with what had already been said, and what no one could quite name yet. The executives entered quietly, their movements more subdued, their eyes more guarded. Some carried their worksheets from yesterday, corners creased and underlined with too many thoughts. Roland arrived on time this time, 8:58 a.m., to be exact, and went straight to his chair at the front without a word. He didn't look at me, but he didn't look away either. We began with a recap of the previous day's exercise, conflict mapping, and emotional aftermaths. I asked for 2 volunteers to reflect on what surfaced overnight. The chief strategy officer spoke about the guilt she'd carried for years after a department-wide layoff. The VP of operations admitted she hadn't realized how defensive she sounded until she reread her own quotes transcribed during the exercise. Honest, measured, vulnerable. I watched Roland out of the corner of my eye. He shifted in his seat. A subtle clench of the jaw. He wasn't detached. He was bracing. Next came the centerpiece of the morning, pattern reflection, a guided session examining recurring emotional behaviors in high-stakes environments. I introduced the concept simply. We all have patterns, and when we become leaders, those patterns become policies. The room was still. Each participant received a behavioral map, charting their emotional responses against leadership scenarios. As they began to work, quiet filled the space, broken only by the scribbling of pens. Except from Roland's chair. His page remained blank. One by one, they began to share. Nadia, the regional director for APAC, raised her hand. I noticed that whenever I'm challenged, I immediately defer to data. It's not about proving I'm right. It's about hiding how uncomfortable I feel not being in control. Another voice chimed in. I do the same. I use procedure as armor. A few nods, a few half smiles. I let it breathe. Let them own their confessions. Then, Roland let out a quiet chuckle. Not amused, dismissive. Nadia looked at him. Something funny? He sat up slightly, shrugged. No, just, corporate therapy isn't really my thing. The room tensed, but I didn't intervene. Instead, I turned to the group. Let's keep going. Leadership doesn't require agreement, just awareness. Then Alex, the global marketing director, leaned forward, tapping his pen thoughtfully. I've been wondering, who actually wrote this program? He asked. Because it doesn't feel like something that came from a standard L&D team. Every module, every line, it's surgical, like someone's been on the inside of this with us. All eyes turned to me, including Roland's. There it was, the moment. I let the silence hold, not to avoid the question, but to let it settle in their minds. Then I said, calmly, it was designed by someone who believed leadership doesn't start with power. It starts with pattern recognition and pain. Alex narrowed his eyes. So, it was you. I smiled slightly. What matters more is whether you're willing to let it work. Roland's jaw tightened, his arms crossed. for the first time. He looked exposed, not because of what I said, but because everyone around him had heard it too. That was the crack he hadn't planned for. Not confrontation, not accusation, recognition. The people in this room were starting to see. Not just the value of the program, but the source of it. And they were comparing, not just content, but character. The room grew still again. Not awkward, focused. I watched Roland shrink slightly into his chair, not visibly, but internally. The way someone does when they realize they no longer control the narrative. I didn't need to push, I just moved forward. "Let's take a break," I said gently. 15 minutes. Then we'll talk about how we protect ourselves through performance and what that costs us. They filed out slowly, some quiet, some whispering. Roland stood last, for a second. He looked like he wanted to say something. He didn't. He just walked out. And for the first time, he didn't look sure of himself. By the time we reached Module 4, the air in the room had changed completely. It wasn't resistance anymore. It was heaviness. Still, dense, like the entire group was holding its collective breath. The exercise was called Reflection of Power. It was always the turning point. I wrote the question on the board slowly, deliberately. What did your power protect you from? And who paid for that protection? No one moved. Papers sat untouched. Pens hovered. Even the HVAC hum felt louder than usual. I looked around the circle. Eyes were fixed on the prompt, but bodies were rigid, shoulders drawn, jaws locked, hands clenched. The kind of stillness that happens not because people are at peace, but because they're paralyzed. Then I glanced at Roland. He wasn't frozen like the others. He was unraveling. Quietly. His page was blank. His fingers tapped, stopped, then gripped the sides of his chair. Sweat gathered just beneath his collar. Barely visible. But there. A man who'd once controlled entire boardrooms now couldn't face a single sentence. But I didn't say anything. I let the silence do the work. Then, from the far end of the circle, someone stood. It was Liana Blake, head of people and culture, early 40s, steady gaze, composed. But I recognized the set of her shoulders. She wasn't just bracing herself to speak. She was stepping into something larger. "If I may," she said quietly, addressing the room. "I think something needs to be acknowledged before we move forward." All eyes turned to her. Even Roland looked up, wary. Liana's voice didn't rise, but it landed hard. "5 years ago," she began, "I was one of the youngest directors in this company. I was ambitious, competent, and completely disconnected from myself. I led like the people I thought were powerful, sharp, fast, always in control. I thought empathy was weakness. I thought emotion got in the way." She paused. "And then I was trained by Callie." The silence cracked. No one spoke. But the weight in the air shifted, like gravity had pulled everyone slightly forward. Liana continued. "She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't shame me. She asked me questions no one else had the nerve to ask. And she helped me realize that the person I was becoming wasn't someone I'd want to follow." A few glances shot toward me. I remained still. Liana took a breath. "I say this because what we're doing here, it's not just a program. It's not some framework pulled from a shelf. It came from someone who understands leadership at the level of being, not just doing. And frankly, if that makes us uncomfortable, good, it should." Roland shifted in his seat, but Liana wasn't finished. "I was the one who requested Callie be brought in for this session," she said, scanning the room. "I didn't put my name on the request because I was afraid. I was afraid Roland would cancel it the moment he saw me attached to it." Gasps didn't follow. There was no scandalous outcry, just silence again, but different now, full of realization. Roland's expression didn't change, but his posture did. He didn't lean back, he didn't nod. He just sat there. Callie's presence, once tolerated, was now undeniable, and Roland, once the tallest presence in the room, suddenly looked small. Liana sat back down, calmly. Her job was done, and she'd just handed the room a truth no one could unhear. I didn't thank her. I didn't need to. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about gravity. Instead, I walked to the board and wrote a new question beneath the first. If leadership is about influence, who's been influencing you the most? No one moved to answer it. And that, finally, was the point. No one moved. The room had gone completely still after Liana's confession. The words, "I was the one who brought Callie back," still echoed between the walls like a dropped glass that never stopped shattering. Even the air conditioning felt too loud now. I didn't speak. I just stepped back from the whiteboard, leaving the final question hanging. If leadership is about influence, who's been influencing you the most? That line hovered above them like a blade. Roland's jaw was tight. His hands, once calmly folded, were now clenched, white-knuckled, trembling slightly. The stillness of his body couldn't hide what was happening underneath. His control was eroding, minute by minute. Then it happened. He stood up, fast, too fast, and pushed his chair backward with a screech. His chest rose and fell with sharp, uneven breaths. He opened his mouth like he was about to dismiss the entire session, to walk out, to reclaim the image of the man who always stayed in charge. But he didn't. Instead, his voice cracked. "I fired the one person who made me look at myself," he said, "because I was terrified she'd expose me." The room didn't react. No gasps, no fidgeting. Just a quiet, collective intake of breath. Every eye turned to him, not as a CEO, not as a leader, but as a man in free fall. Roland's face lost its color. His eyes darted between the floor and the ceiling, avoiding everyone. His next words came softer, almost to himself. "I thought I could control the narrative, replace her, strip her name, turn the mirror away." He looked at me, but it still followed me here. I didn't move. I didn't nod. I let the silence hold. That was the moment he finally broke. He stepped back from the circle, one hand gripping the edge of the chair for support. His shoulders slumped, not like a man tired, but like someone who just realized the performance is over. And then, without another word, Roland turned and walked out of the room. No storming, no dramatics, just retreat. But before the door could fully close behind him, a quiet sound followed, a chair moving in the back corner of the room. Caroline Wu stood. Until now, she'd been silent, a board member, technically an observer in this session. She hadn't spoken once, hadn't so much as raised an eyebrow during the entire training, but she'd seen everything. She picked up her notepad, calmly tucked it under her arm, and walked out behind him. No one said a word. That was the real twist. It wasn't Roland's breakdown. It was that someone with power had witnessed it and chose to follow. I turned back to the rest of the room. A few participants stared at their hands. One person looked out the window, blinking hard. Another exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 30 minutes. Someone whispered, "Did that really just happen?" I nodded slightly. It did. And that was all I needed to say. There was no victory here, no satisfaction in his collapse. Only truth. Finally let loose after being caged too long. Roland didn't break because someone attacked him. He broke because the system he tried to erase had finally done its job. It reflected, and he couldn't unsee what was in the glass. I walked back to the board, slowly wiped away the last question with a clean cloth, and said to the group, "We'll take a break here. Let's give the moment room to breathe." No one moved immediately. They sat there, holding space for what had just unfolded. No one checked their phones. No one reached for coffee. Even in silence, something enormous had shifted, and no one, not even Roland, could undo it now. 2 weeks had passed since Sedona. Callie sat at her desk, the morning sun casting gentle light across the hardwood floor. Her inbox was filled with post-session reflections, anonymous feedback collected by the facilitation firm. She read each one slowly, pen in hand, underlining not the praise, but the moments of clarity. This wasn't training, it was transformation. We didn't need better performance metrics, we needed permission to look inward. I no longer fear losing control, I fear leading without conscience. So, none of the comments mentioned Roland, but they didn't need to. The shift was there, in the tone, the language, the quiet awakening of a company that had been running on authority instead of awareness. She received a message that morning from an old colleague inside Aldridge and Vale. Officially, he's still CEO. Unofficially, they've moved all decision-making to the board. Strategic calls now go through committee. His calendar's empty except for optics. A polite way of saying he'd been neutered without the press release. Callie didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply closed her laptop and walked to the kitchen to make tea. An hour later, her phone rang. The name on the screen made her pause. Caroline Wu, the quiet board member who had followed Roland out of the room after his collapse. She'd never spoken directly to Callie before. Callie, Carolyn began, her voice warm but efficient. First, I want to thank you. You did more in 3 days than most culture firms do in 3 years. Callie said nothing, waiting. We'd like to formally offer you a role, Caroline continued. Chief Leadership Architect, full creative control. You'd rebuild the internal development ecosystem. No gatekeeping, no interference. Callie didn't answer immediately. Caroline filled the silence. We'd also increase your equity stake. You'd report only to the board. It would be yours to shape. It was tempting. It was power. And yet, would I own the program? Callie asked. There was a pause. Not long, but enough. Well, no, Caroline admitted. It would belong to the company, of course, like before. Callie exhaled quietly. Then I have to decline, she said. I no longer lend my voice to systems that erase names from their mirrors. The line stayed silent. Caroline didn't argue. She simply replied, I understand, and ended the call with quiet grace. Callie walked back to her desk. On her screen was the landing page for Reflected Power TM, her own program. Re-engineered from the ground up, it retained the emotional core of her original framework, but now integrated Echo Core, a real-time emotional feedback loop that adapted exercises based on live participant response. It was bold, personal, and hers. She owned the trademark, she held the copyright, and she decided who got to use it. No more NDAs. No more invisible contributions. Just clarity, licensed, an email pinged. From Liana Blake, subject. First partner, you didn't just shift the room, you shifted the culture. I'd like to be your first official partner in bringing this program to others. When you're ready, I'm ready too. Callie read it twice. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped onto her small balcony, tea in hand, the morning air crisp and unsentimental. She looked out at the quiet city, humming with ambition below, but up here, it was still. She wasn't chasing legacy anymore. She was living it. No podium, no reappointment, no applause, just peace. And the silent knowledge that she had become what they were all trying to learn to be. A leader who no longer needed permission to be powerful. The room was modest. No marble walls, no branded backdrops, just clean light, muted tones, and 50 chairs arranged in a wide, honest circle. Callie stood at the center, holding a wireless clicker, her voice calm as the soft hum of the projector behind her. This was the launch of Reflected Power TM, the first public version of the program she once built. Lost, reclaimed, and rebuilt again. There were no executive titles on badges, no hierarchies, just people, showing up to learn how to lead without losing themselves. "You won't leave here with a toolkit," she began. "You'll leave with questions, and if you're brave, you'll keep asking them long after this ends." A few heads nodded. No applause. Good. She didn't want performance. She wanted presence. In the front row sat Liana Blake, notebook open, pen poised. There was no introduction needed. Everyone knew her name now, not because she was loud, but because she had spoken once, and what she said shifted everything. Callie smiled at her, briefly, then clicked to the next slide. A blank screen. And then, one line appeared, centered in white against black. "No leader should outrank their own reflection." The room stilled. "I wrote this line years ago," Callie said. "It was originally part of Module 7. It was removed before publication. Too provocative," they said. "Too poetic. Too much." She turned toward Liana. She saved the only unedited version. A quiet hush passed through the audience. Someone exhaled slowly. Another closed their eyes. "It's not just a quote," Callie continued. "It's a boundary, a reminder that leadership is not about being untouchable. It's about being recognizable, first to yourself." She let the silence breathe, then moved on. But the quote stayed projected on the screen behind her. Later, during the break, someone snapped a photo and posted it online with the caption, "I didn't attend a leadership training today. I met my reflection." Reflected power leadership reimagined within 48 hours. The quote had circled professional networks, reposted by coaches, executives, and even journalists. A major leadership magazine opened its next edition with the line. But Callie didn't track the views. She sat quietly in her small backstage room after the session, sipping tea and watching the shadows stretch across the floor. She didn't need the recognition. She'd already earned something far rarer: peace. As the session ended and participants began to leave, many stopped to say thank you. Some simply nodded. One woman teared up and whispered, "You gave me permission to lead like me again." Callie stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The air was still, balanced. She looked up at the fading sky. Her name was no longer missing. Her voice no longer filtered. Her work no longer borrowed. And the mirror she once held for others had finally become her own.